What's up, y'all? Want to welcome you back to the HuntStand Podcast, Season 2, and this is your host, Will Cooper. The HuntStand Podcast is your weekly source for insightful conversations with veteran hunters, dedicated outdoor enthusiasts, and top industry personnel. I'm going to have guests on here who are true experts in their field, diving into the captivating world of our industry and the great outdoors. With each episode, you, the listener, will receive invaluable knowledge, tips, and guidance on how to enhance your skills in the wild and in life. Tune in to be entertained, informed, and driven to reach new heights. The HuntStand Podcast is brought to you by Yamaha and its full line of class-defining, adventure-seeking motorcycles, ATVs, and side-by-side vehicles. The HuntStand Podcast is also brought to you by Springfield Armory and their lineup of Model 2020 Waypoint rifles. And finally, the HuntStand Podcast is brought to you by StealthCam. It's never been easier to go wireless with the Command Pro app. Capture high-quality photos and videos of all the action wherever you hunt with StealthCam's advanced cameras and data plans tailored to your needs. So make sure to check out their website today, stealthcam.com. HuntStand Podcast, Season 2. Buckle up. It's going to be a good ride. Let's go.
All right, Ron. Well, you ready to get this thing started?
Sure. Should I call you Will or William?
Yeah. William is only when I'm in trouble with my wife. That's when I get that. So
familiar with that.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll keep it with that. But man, first and foremost, just want to welcome you and thank you for your time for hopping on the HuntStand Podcast with me today.
Oh heck, it's my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, man. Love to talk. I know you've been busy lately with all the shows and stuff, so I'm sure you're probably finding time here to wind down, aren't you?
No, actually, I'm busy taking care of deadlines that I missed during a week off. So cranking out articles and prepping up to do another YouTube video here real quick. And yeah, there's always plenty to do, including moving snow off my mile-long driveway, and it's piling up right now.
I'm not jealous of that. It's a balmy 60 degrees here in Texas.
Now, enjoy it, man. You're going to pay the price in July.
Oh, I know. That's when I wish I was up in your neck of the woods around then.
Yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah. Well, man, for this podcast, what I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks is we're going to be hosting a wildest hunt stories ever told. And so I want to talk with you to find out, what that is, and we'll go down a couple rabbit holes. But first and foremost, what I like to do to get each podcast started is I like for our guests to give the listeners kind of that 30-foot tree stand view of what I call of yourself. So, tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, and how you've gotten to where you are in life now.
Oh, sure. I was a typical country kid back in the 50s and 60s. I grew up in South Dakota on family farms. One grandpa was a dairy farmer. The other one was just a general purpose farmer. So the dirty 30s had just passed. So everybody was really conservative, and we sort of did things right. I think everyone worked hard and we didn't waste things. We saved. I kind of grew up a conservative in just the proper sense of that word. And of course, I learned to hunt because it was an exciting thing to do. And in those days, we didn't have all the electronic gizmos to distract us. And my cousins would be out hunting. And as kids, you want to go out with the older guys and get some of that adventure and excitement in. And I think some of us are just born with that genetic for the wild. And I think Aldo Leopold summed it up quite nicely in his seminal work, Sand County Almanac, when he talked about how people would automatically respond to the call of geese passing overhead. But very few of us had an urge to go out and whack a golf ball when we saw one. So I think that was my calling. I just had this intense need to get out into the wilds and get as close as I could to wildlife, whether I was just stalking it to watch it or hunt it and bring it home to eat it. So that's how I got started. And then when I was in high school, I sort of had a natural tact for writing, a talent, I guess. It didn't have one for math, that's for sure.
Same here.
I had an English teacher who was a hunter as well, and he had a lot of different guns and things, and he saw my interest in that, and he encouraged me, and that gave me the idea to become an outdoor writer. So I went to college, and I sort of picked up a teaching degree just in case I fell on my face and I'd have a backup plan. But my intent all along was to try selling some articles. So when I graduated in mid-'70s, I just thought I'd better sit down and get to work. And I cranked out 5 articles and I shipped them around to my favorite magazines and sold all 5 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, first crack out of the barrel. What a deal that was.
Heck yeah. Can't complain about that.
Well, I had been thinking about this for so many years, running them through my mind, and I knew these magazines so well and the direction that they went, and I could just feel that this particular story would work in this magazine, and etc. So I had done a lot of homework basically in my mind before I even started to write these things, and it came out just perfectly to really push me down that track.
Heck
So
yeah.
I continued for several years, and then I got hired on by a state fish and game agency
Mhm.
and worked there in information and education, and then furthered my education in the sciences. I almost went to be a game warden or some biologist and working for fish and game and stuff, but
Okay.
so I always had an interest in that, and I was a birder and interested in plants and biotic diversity and all that fun stuff. So I got to work with the professionals within that agency, and then another one I went to work for a few years later. And then in the early 80s, I was able to cut the apron strings, so to speak, and go full-time freelance, because then I had been in enough magazines and enough editors knew my name that I thought I could probably sell pretty consistently.
Heck
So I
yeah.
did that for several years.
Very nice. Very nice. And you've just been doing that since then, huh?
Yeah, pretty much. We expanded into television about 15 years ago or so, and
Mhm.
got into the YouTube stuff. So now most of my attention goes to the YouTube channels, and I do a podcast. I still write for a few magazines, but it just seems like everything's going towards the digital media. So that's where I focus these days.
Ain't that the truth? It seems like it almost kind of seems like print and television is just fading away year by year.
Yeah, it just, and I think one has to roll with the punches, so to speak, and go with the flow, because basically it's just communication. It
Mhm.
started off around the campfire telling stories. And then when we learned to write and we got paper, we could then reach a larger audience via that paper. And now you've got the electronic way of doing it. So sure, why not?
Why not? You got to be willing to adapt and go with the change.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, man, we're gonna talk wildest hunting stories. You've spent a lot of time out in the woods. You spent a lot of years out in the outdoors, and so I know you and I kind of talked beforehand about a story of being trapped in I think it was the Arctic tundra. So, can you tell us a little bit about the wildest hunting experience you've ever had?
Boy, this is a tough one because there have been so many, for one thing.
Yeah,
They start to blur a little bit. You see photographs and you go, wait a minute, now I remember.
yeah,
But there have been so many where I've been up in the wildest of the wild. That's mostly in Alaska and British Columbia, where I remember one trip we did for stone sheep.
hmm,
And I was already in a camp hunting moose and I think mountain goat. And the outfitter said, hey, you've got a little extra time. You've already got your moose and your goat. How'd you like to join me in a little prospecting mission for sheep? I've got a new area I want to look at. No one's hunted sheep in it for decades. And they don't really know if there are any in there, although someone years and years ago reported there were some. So I'm going to go up there and snoop around. You can come
yeah,
along. So, yeah, you bet. So we flew oh gosh, we were already 2 hours from the nearest town airstrip. And then we flew another hour, I think, and got dropped off at this wilderness lake. And then we just started prospecting. So it was
wow,
really quite an adventure. We threw the packs on and we crossed a river and we crossed another river. And then we started climbing up the mountains. And there were mountain goats all around and grizzly tracks in the sand, as you can imagine. And up we went, and blizzard came in. We were near the top of a peak what was nothing but rock, just stepping over the big rocks. And then the snow hit, and we were going through the snow in a blizzard condition, figuring we were going the right way just by feel. Didn't even bother to look at the compass. And finally, we decided we better sit and wait this thing out because we
yeah,
were pretty much confused about where we were. And I remember when the snow squall finally lifted, I was completely turned around. Other than up and down, I didn't know where I was. But we soon got it all figured out, and we headed on down to a lake, and started snowing again. So we set the tent up and sat inside and turned up the little stove and warmed up some things. And got kind of cozy, and we're waiting for that snow to quit so we could get back out hunting. And when we finally emerged from that tent after, oh gosh, it probably wasn't more than an hour and a half,
Mhm.
there were these giant caribou tracks walking right past the tent. How we
Yeah.
didn't sense that animal. Of course, the wind was blowing and the snow was hissing against the tent. We never heard a thing. And we were looking for a big caribou bull. And it just looked like this was probably one. So we jumped on those tracks and followed them until they just gave us the ditch. We never did see that animal. Even in that big open mountain country where you can see so far, we could not
Jeez.
catch up with him. So that sort of thing continued for several days. We would just hike and look, glass and camp and
Mhm.
just prospecting. And then they finally found a couple of sheep pretty far out. I remember that day, the guide had a newfangled electronic unit that could tell you how far we traveled and up and down. It was essentially a GPS, one of the early
Right.
GPS units. And at the end of the trip, he said, that day that we got those sheep, we went 8,500 feet in elevation, gain and
Wow.
drop and gain and up and down the mountains and stuff. Holy mackerel. You have no idea when you're just out there doing it, other than you're
No.
really tired.
Yeah.
But that was really interesting to finally get a read of what you were actually accomplishing. So that whole trip, we ended up going 18 miles out and back. And then, of course, that elevation gain and stuff. But when we finally found those sheep, there were just two of them, two
Mhm.
rams. And while we were sizing them up and looking for a stalking route, we spotted a massive caribou. I don't know if it's the one that left the tracks by the tent, but this was the biggest caribou I have seen to date. And I've taken some pretty good caribou over the years. This guy was up in the probably pushing 400, maybe a little more. I mean, just an absolute monster. But
Shoot.
we were there specifically for sheep. Could have taken that caribou, but we had to pick one or the other.
Mhm.
So we just had to say, let the caribou go, because stone sheep are not something you do every day. This was my
No.
first stone sheep hunt. And I'd done several bighorns and dolls by then, but
Mhm.
this was probably likely my only stone hunt. So I said, no, let's go for the sheep. So off we went to stalk these sheep. And of course, we had to pick a route that kept us hidden and down or behind a ridge and across a river and up the other side and get into position. And there was one other hunter on the trip, and he had actually paid to be out there on this one. So of course he got first pick and the best of everything. So
Yeah.
we made our stalk on the biggest ram, and these rams weren't even close. They were probably a good 300 yards to maybe 400 yards apart. So the far one was mine because it was smaller. This guy wanted the bigger one. No kidding.
Mhm.
Who could blame him?
I
And
know.
and then of course the outfitter said, I was a friend of his, and he said, hey Ron, don't shoot until this guy's done. When he shoots, then you can shoot. Yeah, I know. It all makes sense. So I lined up on this sheep, and gosh, as I recall, I was shooting a 300 WSM in this super lightweight Kifaru rambling rifle that was lucky to weigh 6 pounds if it was wet. And it was
Jeez.
just a super lightweight rifle. I'd used it quite a bit in previous years in a 7mm '08 Remington, but he'd upgraded it. It had switch out barrels, so he upgraded to a 300. And I was confident with that thing out 400 yards easily, just with a dead on hold with a little elevation. I didn't have a fancy reticle. I wasn't turret dialing in those days. I just had a simple 2-7, I think a 2-7 loophole VX2 scope on it. So
Mhm.
I cranked it up to 7, and I held it over the back of that ram because I knew that bullet was going to drop about 16 inches. And you've got about a 16 to 18 inch deep chest on a ram. You just showed a little bit of daylight over the top of it, and that bullet's going to drop into the heart lung area.
Yep.
So I held there and waited to hear the shot from the other hunter. And after he shot, I pulled the trigger because my ram didn't even look up really. It just kept foraging. It was so far away. And sheep are like that anyway. You shoot and they just kind of look around. They've never seen a human before, most likely. And they weren't afraid of loud noises. It was like thunder. So I launched my bullet, hit him right in the shoulders, and down he went.
Gosh.
And so, gosh, it was like, woohoo, we had 2 rams down. And then, of course, we're a long way from the airstrip.
Jeez.
So we got to work. You took our pictures and started skinning everything out and boning it all, and then packing it out of there. And fortunately, these young guys, I was already in my late 50s, I think.
Mhm.
Young guys were in their late 20s, early 30s, and tough as rocks. Maybe we just packed everything up and they did the bulk of the lifting. I'll tell you that much. And out of there we went. We had to stay one more night. And then the next day we got out. No more snowstorms, thank goodness. The sun came out and it got beautiful. And we just had a gorgeous hike out. Tempted all the way by the biggest mountain goats I've ever seen. Just huge billies up on every little side ridge. And oh gosh. In fact, when we did get back to camp, footsore, and I mean blistered. I had blisters that plagued me for 3 weeks after I got home. They were so deep. But we got back to camp, and this other hunter was drooling over those mountain goats, and he wanted one really badly. So he and the chief guide decided in the morning they would bust up there and try to get one before the plane came in that afternoon. And they pulled it off. They got back with a load of goat meat and the trophy, a big, beautiful Billy. They got back and we loaded everything up in the plane and got the heck out of Dodge. Whew, that was quite the wild adventure.
Man, I want to back up a little bit to the snowstorm, because we breezed past that, and I want to come back to that, because that's a big thing that a lot of people I think they overlook. And so, obviously that was probably an unexpected event that just kind of happened while you were on this hunt. So how did you handle that whenever this whiteout snowstorm just hits? I mean, what's going through your mind when that happens?
Well, of course, I grew up in snow country, played in it when I was a kid, and I understood blizzards. I knew how deadly they could be, so I prepare myself ahead of time.
Yeah.
Just having been in those conditions helps immeasurably. Until you've done that, it's a little bit frightening. But once you've lived through some big blows, and I mean, I'm talking 30-mile-an-hour winds, below zero temperatures, dress properly for it, and learn how to shelter from it. Now, this wasn't anywhere near that cold. It was early snow squall. But the flakes are coming down hot and heavy. So I had that understanding already. I knew what I needed to do was not panic and just get under some shelter. And of course, when you're backpacking, you're prepared. You've got the right gear and clothing on, including some kind of a tarp. Now, one of the guys had a good old-fashioned poncho. And when I first started backpack hunting way back in the mid-70s, I used one of those. But it flaps so much in the wind, it's pretty inconvenient. What I didn't realize was how effective it was for huddling. Big snowstorm like that comes in, instead of having to pull out a big sheet of nylon to cover yourself up, you just pull on his poncho and it covers your pack and everything. And this kid just sat on a rock with that poncho covering everything and huddled up, and he was perfectly warm and dry under that thing while I was trying to hold down the end flaps of my little blanket.
Seriously.
Yeah. So I learned something there from this young guy. It was really worth knowing. The poncho, it's a darned effective tarp. So, but that's the way we do it, is to just be prepared for that kind of thing. And then, of course, I knew that we had sleeping bags in our packs and a tent and the stove. So we, push came to shove, could have just climbed down those rocks and found a flat spot, and we would have been all right if it had kept snowing for another day or two. And I had been out in snows several times prior to that actually collapsed the tent, is how.
Seriously.
Yeah. So once again, having had those kinds of experiences, I think was really essential to keeping your head not panicking in a situation like that.
Where were you hunting whenever you had snow collapse your tents, and like how did that go down?
Oh, those are I remember one was an elk hunt in North Idaho.
Okay.
It's pretty wet up there. If you want to have a wild read, check out Lewis and Clark's journals. When they came across Idaho on the Lolo Trail, which was really primitive in those days, they had to go around big fallen over trees and stuff because the natives didn't have saws to cut this stuff up. So they would just make a new trail around whatever big tree fell. And you can imagine how big those trees were back in those days. And Lewis and Clark came across that in September and got huge snows out of the deal. And they were wet and cold and miserable the whole time. That's the kind of snow I had when we were up there elk hunting. I had a backpack dome tent with fiberglass rods, and the snow piled on that top of that dome and just collapsed it right on top of me.
Jeez, what did you do in a situation like that? you're not expecting that to happen, and just something unexpected that just does that. I mean, what goes through your mind, and how do you just come out of something like that?
Well, it really wasn't that big of a deal. You just realize it's snowing, and once again, you're prepared. You have the right gear. Obviously, you
Mhm.
have to get your tent back up.
Yeah.
I've had some wall tents come down in situations like that, and that's a little bit more work to get the wall tent back up. You're out
Yeah.
hunting, snows all day. You come back, and the wall tent is half leaned over, full of snow, and you have to beat it all off and put everything back up and tighten the guy lines. But with this pop up tent, all I had
Mhm.
to do was push it up, bounce all the snow off the top, and then it gets kind of nice and warm and cozy in there when the snow is that deep because it insulates you. But in the morning, of course, you have to kick at the door and kind of push the snow away, and then carefully open the zippers to get the flap down while you push the snow in front of you so it doesn't all come into the tent. But after that, it's just snow.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of just like sounds like your Arctic hunt where you got stuck in the tent for a few days and stuff like that. More or less, it's just kind of a being prepared and making sure you've got everything that you need
Yeah.
for those situations. So the one thing I want to kind of pick from you is, we've talked about this Arctic hunt. We've talked about, a little bit tents collapsing on you, everything. But can you share a particularly challenging or dangerous hunting experience that you've had?
Challenging. There was a sheep hunt in the desert in southern Idaho in Owyhee County. Owyhee County is one of the bigger wildernesses in Idaho. Not so many people know about it because it's not a
Hmm.
mountain wilderness, it's a dry desert, high desert. And it's a
Yeah.
canyon. It's a canyon reminiscent of the Grand Canyon on a smaller scale. So you have these basalt cliffs that will be, gosh, at least 200, perhaps 300 feet down, vertical
Wow.
stuff, and several ledges like that going down to the river.
Hmm.
And pretty primitive access, some little Jeep trails essentially, so you could pick your way out there over rock fields and stuff with your four-wheel drive, and then start hunting that country. We hunt the edges of it for chucker and chucker season, but this was a sheep tag, one of those once in a lifetime deals. So we were having to scour those canyons to look for the ram. And the big challenge, of course, in a desert is water. We had the river in the bottom, but it came out of some uplands where there were feedlots and farming and different things to pollute the water. So we couldn't really drink that water. Now I since pretty much consistently bring some sort of a filter along and I can filter water. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't think it was going to be a huge problem on this hunt because most of the uplands there are fairly flat to rolling sagebrush country. And then the sheep are hanging in those canyons and they'll come up to the edge and then drop back down to the ledges and stuff to bed. So I figured it was not going to be that hard to get back to the vehicle, which is glass and go a few miles and be back, carry a liter of water. Well, we found the rams on the other side of the canyon. So we had to completely
Oof.
drop down it, stalk them, and then get around them by going a few miles out of our way. And then they spotted us anyway and ran back across the canyon as we had to cross the darn thing again. And it got hotter than blazes. And we ran out of water pretty darn early.
And
We
how
had
hot was it?
Oh gosh, we were probably in the mid 90s, pushing 100 because it was early season, and we were really unprepared. We just did not take enough water along, and then when we ran out, and normally I'd say, okay, let's go back for more water, but we had those sheep in front of us, and we were halfway there, so now you got to keep going, right?
Hmm.
So by the time we got to the cluster of rams, relocated them, and I made the mistake then of shooting one. So then we had to go back down to where he had expired and pack him up and haul him out of there. And it was just sunset, just a little bit after sunset when we finally reached the truck. And I was so dehydrated that I was throwing up, and I really I had some melons in the truck, and I was able to eat some melons that kind of helped pull me out of it, get some electrolytes back in my system. But then turns out we tried to drive out of there, had a flat tire.
Oh gosh.
And I told my buddy I had a little inflatable device. You plug it into the cigarette lighter and it'll inflate the tire because it must have been a slow leak. So he tries to inflate the tire. While he's doing that, the truck shuts down. I'm off in the bushes throwing up with a headache, hoping that nothing happens and I can just sleep all night. And then when he goes back to start the truck, the battery was dead.
Oh god. So y'all are stuck in the middle of the desert.
We were stuck in the middle of the desert. Oh man. So we put we had to change that tire. We never really could fill that one up with that silver little pump. So we changed the tire, and then it was dark, and I just said, man, I'm just too sick to do anything. What are we going to do anyway? The nearest farmhouse is probably 10 miles away or something. Who knows? So we had to stay overnight, which was not a big deal because, again, we had the full camp in the back of the truck.
Right.
But in the morning, it was like, how the heck do we get out of here? We had to dig rocks out of the ground and then fill the holes in with dirt to make a runway to push the truck to start it.
Holy cow.
But that proved our old point back in those days. We would never get an automatic on a backcountry rig like that because you wanted to jumpstart it some way or another.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, it was pretty common. You'd break down and you'd just push a rig down a hill or something and pop the clutch and you'd start. And that's exactly what we did with this old Ford F-150. Thank goodness it caught because we didn't have a runway of more than about 40 yards to push the thing on.
Jeez, man. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge there, running out of water and then you're getting dehydrated like that. And then just to put the cherry on top, the truck just goes into complete haywire mode. I mean, good gosh. I mean, did y'all ever really get worried in that situation with your dehydration, or, I mean, what kind of went through your mind when all that was happening?
Not really worried because you're so sick you don't have time to worry. You just wish it'd be over. Your head's throbbing and you have to throw up, and I've been there before. I've been dehydrated before, and I knew the symptoms. And it's always been one of my shortcomings as an outdoorsman is that I don't drink enough, don't stay hydrated. I've always had a struggle with that. So once again, experience helps, and I knew that sort of thing could happen. It had happened before, so I thought, sleeping it off for 6-8 hours and then slowly rehydrating should solve it. And by the morning, I was fine.
So the moral again there is just being prepared.
Well, that's why it's the old Boy Scout motto. What they taught us in Boy Scouts, be prepared. I took that to heart and understood it, both by reading it, being taught it, but then slowly discovering it. As kids, we would go out overnight camping and stuff, just in farm country. We'd find an old creek somewhere and go up and put out a tent. So we gradually learned, without any really serious threat of danger, we learned to bring the right stuff. If we didn't bring the right materials to start a fire, we went without a fire. Well, no big deal. We'll hike back to the barn and the farmhouse and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
So you learn that stuff through trial and error when it really is not going to kill you, so that when you finally venture into the wilds where it could kill you, you've learned your lessons and prepared yourself. What's really been interesting to me over the years is how often wilderness guides won't be prepared. I remember one sheep hunt we did when we saw these rams at a great distance, and we hiked over there. I think we went about 8 miles to get to those.
Wow.
And then it was late evening when we got there, and it was like, we should probably camp here. I had my pack and my sleeping bags and emergency supplies in my pack, so I knew I could overnight. But this guy didn't, and he was the guide, and he was an older guide too. And then we ended up shooting a ram, and it was like, well, here comes some weather, and we could get weathered in for days. If we want to kill this sheep, we probably ought to push the envelope and go now. It was sunset. It was getting gray. It was starting to drizzle. We pop over the hill. There he is. He takes off running. I shoot him. He falls down the mountain about 60 miles. So clear to the bottom to recover him. And then once we do that, it starts to rain, and it's like, man, it's getting dark and it's getting miserable, and we're going to be, we're a good 8 miles and probably 1,000 feet up. Let's just bivouac here. So we literally cut ledges in the slope. It was kind of a scree slope. So you're able to cut a ledge into that softer scree and then lie on it. So we were stacked vertically, one above the other. And I had a large enough nylon tarp that I could cover both of us. So I had an Ensolite sleeping pad and a sleeping bag, and I was cozy. But this guy, all he had to sleep on was the rock, and he got to use the overlap of my space blanket essentially to cover himself up from the rain. So he lay there under the drizzle. It wasn't a flood or anything, just a miserable drizzle until it first light. And then we popped up and finished butchering up that ram and pack him into the packs and climbing out of there. And then it was one of those 2 steps forward, 1 step back because of that soft scree slope, which is always a major pain in the butt.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about 2 situations that you've been in where you faced some challenges. Luckily, you were prepared. Have you ever found yourself in a very dangerous situation where, the thought that went through your head was, man, I don't know if I'm going to make it out of here alive? I mean, have you ever faced something like that?
Yeah, a couple of times. Neither of them were really hunting. One was up in the mountains, the Cascade Mountains in Washington, involving
Mhm.
a canoe in a creek on which it should have never been launched.
Oof.
I'd been canoeing for several years in the flatlands of the Dakotas on some fairly calm rivers, and here was this rushing stream that was really too small to canoe, except for it was midsummer, very hot, and the glaciers were melting. So
Oof.
those streams come up really high, really fast,
Mhm.
and it looked like it would be fun to put this, call it the aluminum scow canoe. Back in the days after World War II, the aluminum was the big thing, and that was a lightweight canoe in those days.
Sheesh.
It was lying up against this cabin, and I grabbed this friend of mine and said, "Hey, did you ever canoe before?" He said, "No, but I'd like to." So those 2 idiots put this canoe in the water and launched. And I remember I was in the stern and told the kid in the front some of the basics about prying and reaching out and keeping that bow in the right position for us to go around the bends and whatnot. Of course,
Yeah.
he was a novice, and he said, "Yeah, okay, I got it." Well, he didn't, especially in the hurry. I mean, my gosh, we got out in the main current with about 2 strokes, and that was going so fast that a normal stroke I couldn't even keep up with it. The canoe would be past my paddle before I could put any pressure to pull myself
Jeez.
forward. I needed to be paddling backwards is what I needed to be doing. And it was way too much for me, and certainly was too much for this novice in the bow. But I was at least keeping us straight in the current from the stern as we
Mhm.
went around these fairly sharp bends. We came around one bend, and right in front of us is a sweeper or a widowmaker, a spruce tree that had fallen into the creek. And it had all these jabs sticking out. All these little branches and stuff were sticking out like a comb. And we were headed for it. And it was like, oh my gosh. But before we got there was a stump in the creek, and we were heading right for that stump. And I remember yelling something to the kid in the front about prying the bow away from that stump so we could sloop around it. And he didn't get it. He put us directly on it. We hit it literally nose first right into that stump so hard that we broke the thwarts off the canoe. The aluminum cross pieces that hold the sidewalls together on top, ping, it went off like a rifle shot. I could hear it going, and it was gone. And then the canoe tipped over in the current, and down we went. So I'm thinking I better save this canoe or that guy's going to really be mad at me. So I'm behind the canoe, downstream of the canoe. It's coming at me, and I'm trying to guide it to shore, and it pushes me right into that sweeper. And
Oof.
it pushes me under the sweeper, underwater. So of course I let go of the canoe, and now I'm thinking these branches kind of hurt. There are stobs that are sticking out in my chest and my stomach, and they don't feel very good, but I just have to get out of here. So I grabbed a couple to pull myself up, and I couldn't get my head out of the water. I thought, what the heck is going on? It was snagged in my shirt. Back
Ooh.
in back in those days, we had these silly T-shirts. They were called fishnet T-shirts. Being in your mid-20s, you think you're all macho and you want to show off to the girls, so you'd wear these stupid T-shirts with holes in them so they could see your muscles.
Now you got a
That's what
picture. Is there a picture of that somewhere? Are you in that?
Thank God, no.
Oh God.
And those fishnets on that shirt were perfect for grabbing those stobs
Whew.
and holding me underwater. That's what my problem was. So with one hand, I'm reaching down and ripping this shirt to get off of these branches and ripping my belly as I'm coming up. I had a scar down my belly for years after that. I'm
Wow.
scrambling out of that thing, but I got my head up out of the water, so I had a bit of a waterfall going over the top of it.
Mhm.
And of course, like a typical freaked out idiot, I start screaming, "Help, help, help," until I realized A, the roar of the water, and B, the wilderness situation in which we were. There was nobody to hear me.
No.
So So I finished pulling myself out of there. I got all bloody. And then I'm thinking, oh my God, if I'm in this kind of trouble, imagine what this kid who's never been canoeing for, what happened to him? I'm afraid I'm going to have to find a dead body or something. So I start running down the bank looking. And there's plenty of willows and the usual stuff, so I'm having to break through and peek around the corners and look in the water, and I'm yelling his name. And I heard something a little bit further below me on the street, and there was a fisherman down there. So I ran up to him, and he kind of looked at me with his eyes wide, with the blood coming down my shirt. And he goes, what's going on? I said, you see a guy come by here? What, a guy come by? What do you mean? He said, I saw a paddle. And I said, oh my God, he's dead, So we start looking. And we come around a point, and he's on the other side of the creek, standing there looking around with a canoe.
With the canoe.
Where I am. Yeah. He came out of it in a lot better shape than I did.
Shoot, sounds like it.
Man. So that was a crazy one.
So would you say you were unprepared on that one?
Definitely.
Man. So how, going through all these stories, I'm sure we could probably pick your brain for hours just hearing about stories of, things and situations where you were prepared. But how have these experiences impacted you moving forward into new situations, hunting situations, or just any kind of survival or life situation?
Well, we've pretty much touched on the essential, which is the be prepared part. It's just silly to not be prepared, but what it does, and I think it's as much older age and experience as anything that's got me away from solo hunting. I used to do a lot of solo hunting. I took my first elk on a solo hunt. I almost died on that one from driving off the road after I'd shot the elk and hauled it out and got it packed up and everything. And I started driving. I had this Toyota van back in those days. I built a kind of a cabin in the back with a kitchenette, and I could cook in there and sleep and store all my gear and everything else. Pretty convenient little tool. And as I was driving off Forest Service roads, twisty, windy roads, I heard a clunking sound behind me, and I remembered that I had left my little gas pump up backpack stove on the kitchen table, and it had fallen off, and I thought it might be leaking gas all over. So I turned between the seats and I reached back to pull that thing off the floor. And as I did that, I came onto a curve and drove off of it.
Yeah.
And of course, I tried to back up when I stopped, and it wouldn't go anywhere. I thought, what the heck? And I was all mad at myself, and I jumped out and slammed the door, and the back tire wheel was off the ground, and the thing was swaying like in a movie when they're hanging off the cliff and about to go over. I did not get back in. I stood there and looked around and just tried to figure out what to do. And after a while, some other hunters came by, and I said, hey, you got a chain? We can pull me out of here. And they looked at it and said, I'm not hooking onto that thing that'll pull me over with it. So it took several guys coming by, and we got enough length of cable and chain and whatnot and a winch that we were able to winch up to a tree to try to pull it out. But we couldn't get the dumb thing out. It was hanging on by a little lodgepole pine that might have been 3 inches in diameter against the front wheel. That's all that was holding it up. And it was a near vertical, I'd say it was 45-degree angle, which doesn't sound really huge, but until you get in a mountain and see one.
That's a big angle.
Yeah, not very many places you can actually look down at a 45-degree angle. And it was all big, jagged rocks all the way down. So nobody was willing to hook a vehicle on there and pull, and we couldn't get it pulled out. So I had to stay with somebody else's camp that night, and they drove me into the town. It was a long, long way to the nearest town, and get an actual wrecker to come out there and pull me out of that thing.
Man.
So yeah, that was a stupid near-death experience.
Man, I'd be doing the same thing that you would. I would have gotten out, and I wouldn't have farted with that. I wouldn't have touched it with a 10-foot pole. No. So, we've talked about all these situations. I think that the moral that we've kind of come to is the preparedness and being prepared. And, you need to have all the correct equipment. So that way, when you find yourself in situations like these, you know what to do and know how to handle it. But, aside from the equipment, I want to talk about what's between your two ears, and that's being mentally prepared.
Yeah.
Right. For me, being a guy from Texas and you being a guy up where you are and dealing with snow all the time, I feel like there's people that will have the mindset to handle these situations and be prepared and do what they need to like that. But then there's people who may not have those experiences like you have, that they can find themselves panicking and
Yeah.
freaking out in a hurry. So how do you talk to how do you talk to that listener right now that could find themselves in a situation? Like, what piece of advice do you have for them to help them not go into panic mode when they find themselves in the Arctic tundra in the middle of a winter blizzard, or taking an 8-mile trek thinking they can get back to the truck in time after the killing of an animal, but they're really stuck up in the mountain? Like, how do you prepare them for that?
Yeah, that's excellent. I've written a lot of articles about backpack hunting and touched on this. And I always say you have to be thoroughly prepared with your gear and understand what you need. And then I would outline the gear. But as you're saying, you can have all the right gear and still panic. When I was in my 20s, I went to a survival class taught by a gentleman from Colorado who did sort of that thing. And he was also on the rescue teams. And he would tell us stories about guys who had all the gear they needed to survive a situation, but they panicked and died. He said, I found one guy threw all of his clothes off as he was running through the woods trying to find his way back to camp. And we found him frozen around a tree, hugging it with his clothes all off. Like, what possesses someone to do that?
What?
He just completely lost it. And he had story after story like that about people who just freaked out. And what that told me was no matter how prepared you are with information, until you've had some experience in those situations, you don't necessarily know how to apply those tools. So he said the best survival tool you can carry doesn't weigh a thing. It's in your head. It's your brain. Well, your brain weighs something, but it's got to be there. Yeah. And he said that is what's going to see you through. Just don't panic. Most situations in which people die, they don't have to die because they panicked and hugged the tree naked instead of huddling behind a tree with all their clothes on and waiting for someone to rescue them, kind of a thing. So yes, do study and be prepared. Know how to use all your survival tools. Always carry them with you. For instance, I will have in my vest pockets fire starters, compass. I don't trust anything with a battery. Bring it along if you want, but don't depend on it.
Yeah.
Have a compass and know how to use that compass. You've got to have worked with that darn compass before. And if you're a map reader and can use a compass, and now you're way ahead. But just knowing the lay of the land and how, downhill, water flows downhill. Well, follow it and you'll find civilization. Yeah, but you might have to go through the Grand Canyon before you get there.
No joke.
Even if it's a small canyon, it can just be a tiny creek. But that's not the absolute solution. So it helps to know the country you're in. Sometimes you do have to go uphill. Ooh, you got time for a quick story?
Let's hear it.
Friend of mine wants to come out elk hunting. This is back in the 80s.
Yeah.
I don't know him real well, but we've done some stuff together. And he says, oh, gosh, your stories about elk hunting sound great. I've always wanted to do that. Can I come out? Sure, come on out. I'll show you where my camp is. But I got to tell you, if I get an assignment to go somewhere else, I have to take that. So I might not be able to stay with you. But I'll show you where the camp is. I'll show you the trails that I use and where I usually find elk, et cetera, et cetera. So he and I spent the summer trading notes and stuff. And I told him what to bring and how to get there and all the rest of it. And I emphasized being in shape. I said, you've got to be prepared for this. So best shape of your life, better than you were playing football in high school. You've got to really, because everything is steep up here, brushy, rocky, and it's all up and down, and it's huge country. You've got to really be prepared. You must have a pack with your survival gear in it. What I started talking about, fire starters and compasses and all these things. I said, carry 2 compasses. 2 compasses, what for? I said, because you're not going to believe the first one. You're going to think, no, wait, that can't be north, man. That's the exact opposite of north. So you won't believe your compass. But if you have 2 of them, then you probably will.
Yep.
Okay. So then he says, hey, Ron, I got to drive all the way from Nebraska. I'd like to share the expenses with it. Can I bring a friend along? Yeah, go ahead. Bring a friend along. So he brings a friend along. The friend didn't take any advice. He spent his summer getting in shape on a lawn chair, tipping beers. So they get out, and of course I got an assignment and couldn't be there, but they go to the camp I told them about, and they set up their tent, and they walk over the edge of the hill, look down, and there are elk right below them in the meadow. I mean, they're a long ways away on a steep downhill, but by golly, there are elk there, and one of them even has antlers. They are all excited. So in the morning, man, we're just going to run right down there and kill one. They bail off in the morning. They pretty soon get lost in the big woods. They lose one another. They never do find the meadow or the elk, and it starts to rain, and then it starts to snow. And this kid can't find his buddy, but he figures he better get the heck out of there. So he looks at his compass and goes, that can't be north. He gets his other compass out and says, well, I guess it is. I better trust it. So he hikes on out of there, and it took him forever. He thought, I didn't think I was ever going to get back up to that trail. And he finally got back up there, and he found the camp, and he went, whew, hallelujah, now where's my buddy? And he couldn't find his buddy. And he was yelling and screaming and thinking, well, he'll get back eventually. And then he sees his buddy's pack laying in the corner of the tent. The guy didn't even bring along his basic day pack with his survival gear in it. So now, my friend's pretty worried. Here comes a Forest Service snowplow. It says, guys, a big storm. We're moving all the camps out of the high country, because what happens is this big storm comes in and you will not get out. It could snow 4 feet up here. So pack up your stuff and go. I can't pack up. My buddy's out there yet. He's got to get back here. And just, well, get as much stuff ready as you can. And I'll go to the end of the road and pick up the rest of the camps and stuff, and I'll lead you all out. Well, the guy comes back in an hour or two, and all the other vehicles are following him out as he plows. This kid's friend's not there yet. He said, I can't leave him up here. So the Forest Service guy says, I'll lead these people below the snow line, and I'll come back for you. He comes back, but he's still not there. Well, hop in. We'll drive to the end of this road and come back one more time. Maybe we'll find him. They're on their way back when they see him trudging down the road, literally dragging his rifle by the sling. And they pull up to him and say, hallelujah, there he is. And they, hey, you idiot, where you been all day? Get in. And the guy just keeps walking. He doesn't even hear him. They had to physically pick him up and put him in the rig.
Holy cow.
So they got out of there, got back to town, got into a hotel, hot showers and everything else. And so this kid says, well, that was quite a storm we survived. I think in the morning we'll go back out there and we'll stay below the snow line and put in a camp, and then we'll just hunt up. His buddies who'd gotten lost said they figured he'd gone 30 miles that day based on what he told them. And they checked the maps, wandering around trying to find his way back. At any rate, he said, no, we're not. What do you mean? He says, I'm going home. We're going home? We just got here. He says, I don't care. I made a pact with God. I said, get out of here alive. I am never going elk hunting again. And he made him go home. That was the end of that kid's elk hunt in Idaho. But that's the thing about being prepared mentally. You know, the guy was just not prepared at all, even though he had the right gear in his pack. He didn't bring the pack along. And then he panicked and started running and looking for his way back. And I mean, it was terrible. But that's the kind of stuff that happens. So what I recommend people do is to go out before the hunting season and get into that environment if you can. I mean, if you're living in Nebraska right now and it's winter, go out in that snowstorm and see how long you can stand it in your best hunting clothes with a tarp over you or whatever you're planning to bring along, and just see what it's really like. Let your brain get accustomed to that whole scenario. Those environmental conditions can just beat the fear right into you if you're not prepared. And then consider even sleeping out in it. Put your tent up in the backyard when it's snowing and sleep in the darn thing. You can make it. You'll survive.
You know, we're talking prepared, having the gear, not panicking, but the thing that's kind of going through my mind right now that I think the listeners are probably thinking as well. It's like, okay, let's say I've got all the gear. Let's say I've tested it, and I know how to use it. I've been in these situations, but I still have that panic that's creeping up on me when I'm in that situation. Like, how do you stop from panicking? I mean, like, how does Ron find himself in that situation where he's prepared, he's had the experience, he's got the gear, everything? What are you telling yourself in your mind to not panic? Is it just more, it's something you're not thinking twice about? Or, I mean, what do you tell that guy?
No, I mean, you'll definitely think twice about it. But once again, you have to go back to your experience, including what you've heard and read, like the teacher, the survivalist who told me about these people throwing their clothes off and doing crazy things. All of that adds up to give you the necessary intelligence And then it's a matter of fortitude. I'm sure each individual has varying degrees of this ability to remain calm. Some people are just a little bit hyper and they get too excited too quickly.
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of training. You've got to train yourself. And again, the more experience you've had, the more information you have, and the better prepared you are, the easier it is to do that. So just knowing that you can stay out in a snowstorm in Nebraska or New England, wherever you are, in your backyard and survive it tells you that the house doesn't have to be 50 feet from me. I can be
Right.
out in these conditions where there's nothing but howling wilderness for 15 miles in every direction. And it's the same thing. I'm going to survive. And I know in my pack, I've got a little one burner stove, and there's enough fuel to run that stove about 12 times or whatever it is. So I'm not going to waste that fuel, but in an emergency, I've got it. I need to find shelter. I need a roof over my head. Should be a tarp in your pack to provide that roof. But if you spent some time studying the old woodmanship, the woodcraft skills of pine boughs and making a lean-to and all those kinds of things, man, all that stuff adds up to that solid knowledge you have to where you could be like Daniel Boone and say, I've never been lost, but I was mighty confused for a couple of weeks. And you're going to survive. Just think how many humans over the millennium have been out in what we now call wilderness, and that was their natural living condition.
Absolutely.
The human animal can survive it.
Absolutely. And just coming back to what you're saying, I think it's just all a mindset thing. I mean, when you know you've got the gear, you know that you know how to use it, you know what to do in that situation. I think it's more or less like you're saying, being prepared doesn't mean just having the gear. It's making sure that you're putting yourself in the mindset that if you are in that situation, you can handle it and you don't end up naked hugging that tree.
Yep. Absolutely right.
Love it. Well, Ron, I know we're running out of time here, but you have any last parting advice for listeners out there, when we're talking about preparedness and mindset?
Yeah, it would be embrace it. Embrace this whole idea of being a modern mountain man, someone who is in tune with his environment. And I don't mean his urban environment or his suburban environment. I mean the environment in which you want to go and find your spiritual joy in reconnecting with nature. I think that's at the heart of why most of us want to hunt.
Yeah.
It is to discover and grasp and share the beauties of nature and the joy that we get from that interaction. And just like, you think about a little chickadee, tiny little mite of a bird living outside at 60 degrees below zero, chittering around, happy as can be because he knows that he has all the ingredients needed for survival in that environment. And we need to be the same way. We don't have the feathers to keep us warm, but we've got some awfully good clothing these days. You get the rest of the shelter you need. And then it's just knowing that it's going to work and you're going to survive it. And you're strong enough to walk out. Don't panic.
Absolutely. Can't panic. Well, Ron, anywhere you can find, anywhere on social media we can find you, you want to let the listeners know where we can see all your work, anything like that?
Sure. You can go to my website, ronspomeroutdoors.com. And there's also a YouTube channel, Ron Spomer Outdoors YouTube. And then I have another YouTube channel that's also my podcast. So it's called Ron Spomer Outdoors Podcast. So you can watch me blather as you listen to me, or you can just go to your podcatcher and listen to me there. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook. I don't post there as often as I should probably, but I've got fairly active sites on there. And then you'll see my articles pop up in American Hunter Magazine, Sports Afield, and Sporting Classics magazines, and a few others from time to time.
Got it. Well, Ron, once again, appreciate your time today, and thanks again for hopping on the HuntStand podcast.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, Will. Good talking to you.
Absolutely, man. It was a good time. We'll have to do it again before long.